Das ist der Platz des verbrecherischen Anschlages, den ein kleiner Kreis gewissenloser Offiziere am 20. Juli auf den Führer und auf den Stab der Wehrmachtführung verübte. Ein gerechtes Schicksal hat das Verbrechen missglücken lassen.
On the 20th of July 1944, an attempt at a coup d'etat was made in National Socialist Germany. The coup involved a group of army officers seizing power after the successful assassination of Adolf Hitler. The plotters came from all sorts of backgrounds. Some of them, like Berlin police chief Wolf-Heinrich Graf von Helldorff, were old Nazi fighters with a long record of crime on their hands. Others were politicians who had once opposed the Nazis in the Reichstag and other places of government. Others were professional army officers who maybe had initially accepted the Hitler regime, but as time progressed had come to loathe it. And others were clergymen, such as Ulrich Sporleder, who had been opposed to National Socialism from the very beginning. Ulrich Sporlede was born on the 7th of July 1911 in Schwerte. Schwerte is a town in the Ruhr area close to Unna. In 1911 it was an industrial town. The first nickel coins in Germany were produced here after a nickel smelting process that had been discovered in the 19th century. Ulrich Sporlede was born as the second of 3 children into a wealthy landowning family, originally from Mecklenburg and Silesia. The family of Ulrich Sporlede included a number of mayors in towns such as Hermann, Aschersleben, Havelberg and Berlin-Adlershof. The painter Clara Sporlede was his aunt, the sculptor Leonora Gerber Sporlede his cousin, the writer, philologist and psychologist Gert Schimanski his brother-in-law, and the opera singer Kurt Manfred Sporlede was his brother. The young Ulrich had spent his youth mainly in Frankfurt am Main and Braunfels Castle, Lahn, in relative financial security despite the troubling 1920s. He also came into contact early on with Christian youth movements, and Pastor Martin Niemöller became a close friend. He also counted amongst his friends a number of officers of the Reichswehr and later the German Wehrmacht. After graduating from high school in Wetzlar, Sporlede studied theology at the University of Königsberg from the summer semester of 1930. In the winter semester of 1931-32, Sporlede continued his studies at the University of Marburg before returning in the summer semester of 1932 to the University of Königsberg. In 1933, conservative elements in the German establishment persuaded President Paul von Hindenburg to elevate Adolf Hitler to the chancellorship. Within a short time, using violence and the threat of violence, Hitler was able to make himself dictator and eliminate other political parties. The attempts by the regime to embrace the Protestant Church into its worldview encouraged people like Ulrich Sporlede to resist it. This is Altenburg in Thuringia. In 1931, a group called the German Christians had run for church representative elections here. On the 6th of June 1932, the Berlin pastor Joachim Hossenfelder founded the German Christian faith movement as an inner evangelical church for the entire country. In its guidelines of the same day, it stated, "We see race, ethnicity, and nation as life orders given to us and entrusted to us by God. Therefore, racial mixing must be opposed. We see the Jews as a serious danger to our ethnicity. It is the gateway for foreign blood in our national body. In particular, marriage between Germans and Jews must be prohibited." This program also included the dissolution of the 29 regional churches governed by synods and the creation of a Reich Church structured according to the Führer principle, the exclusion of Jewish Christians, the de-Judaization of the Church's message through turning away from the Old Testament, reducing and reinterpreting the New Testament, the purification of the Germanic race through protection from incompetent and inferior people, and the destruction of Marxism. That was the Christian message as this church saw it. This organisation came about entirely independently of the National Socialist Party, although clearly they both had similar ideologies. Perhaps it too came about as the result of the collapse of the Second Reich in 1918 and the overturning of the conservative order that it had once represented. The poverty and despair of the market crash of the early 1930s might have added to its convictions. Once Hitler came to power, it was the German Christian Church that was favoured by the state and seen as an arm of the party, and thus the state. Those that disapproved came together in the Confessing Church, representing the traditional evangelical church of which Sporleder was a member. Sporleder took the view that it was not the Confessing Church which had placed itself outside the state, but that the Nazi state itself was causing exclusion and resistance through its totalitarian ideology. In fact, many theology students tried to demonstrate their nationalist sentiments and even their willingness to participate in the construction of a National Socialist Germany by joining the SA, but they quickly came to the conclusion that National Socialism and Christianity were incompatible. On the 9th of November 1934, Sporleder announced that there would be a discussion with Professor Hans Michael Müller about his book On the Enemy of the State in the university's main auditorium. Fellow students such as Manfred Koschonka and Horst Szymanowski later described these discussions, which was shaped by Sporleder, as a last place of freedom in the midst of a lack of freedom and ideological terror. On the 28th of November 1934, under Sporleder's leadership, the Brotherhood of Vicars and Assistant Preachers of the East Prussian Church Council was founded as part of the Second East Prussian Church Congress. Among the founding members, Sporleder belonged to the so-called radical wing of the Young Brothers, which rejected any concessions or compromises towards the Nazi state. Consequently, at a meeting of the East Prussian Brotherhood Council on the 12th of April 1935, he called for an uncompromising stance and consistent action against the Nazi state that affected the appointment of professors at the theological faculties. In addition, Sporleder argued that all prisoners in the concentration camps had the right to have access to religious services. Sporleder was also instrumental in inviting Martin Niemöller to East Prussia and the organisation of his associated lecture tours and guest sermons. Niemöller was a former submarine commander. He's now famous for his quote, "When the Nazis came for the communists, I remained silent. I was not a communist. When they locked up the Social Democrats, I remained silent. I was not a Social Democrat. When they came for the trade unionists, I remained silent. I was not a trade unionist. When they came for me, there was no one left to protest." Incidentally, this is the original quote. You will notice that there's no mention of coming for the Jews. That was something that was added later by others. From December 1935 to April 1936, Sporleder worked as a private tutor at Dönhofstadt Chateau, today Drogosha in northeastern Poland. He was here at the invitation of Albert Graf zu Stolberg-Wienergerode. At Dönhofstadt he was protected from invigilation by the Gestapo, and at the same time was given the opportunity to prepare for his first exam before the now underground examination committee of the East Prussian Confessing Church Synod. At Dönhofstadt Chateau he also wrote his thesis. From the 16th to 19th of March 1936 he was one of 19 candidates to take his first theological exam with the Confessing Church in East Prussia. On the 25th of April 1936 he became a member of the founding committee for the Theological Department's academic camp in Tilsit, and on the 15th of June 1936 he travelled to Poznan in Poland for the Student Day. During this time he wrote a sermon on Hebrews 12 verses 1 to 6, in which he called for struggle and resistance in response to the Nuremberg race laws, with the words, "Today we Christians and Jews are more than ever one race. We are both descended from the lineage of David." From the 1st of May 1936 until he had to join the Reich Army on the 17th of October 1936, he worked as a vicar in Heilsberg, East Prussia, which is today Lidzbark-Warmiński in northern Poland. He received his training as an officer cadet in one of East Prussia's traditional hussar regiments. He then worked as a vicar under Pastor Werner Lembruck in Renhof, today Riewo, and as a preacher in Marienwerder, today Kwidchen, where he succeeded in building up a new confessional congregation. On the 14th of November 1937, Sporleder preached at a so-called Church Day of the Confessing Church together with Lembruck and other pastors, assistant preachers and preachers in various churches in Elbling, today Elbląg. He was then arrested for the first time by the Gestapo, along with Werner Lembruck and 6 other colleagues. He was imprisoned until the 21st November 1937, first in the Gestapo prison and finally in the Elbling court prison. His sermons, telephone conversation and correspondence had already been monitored for some time and were now used to justify his pre-trial detention and the filing of charges. On the 7th and 14th of December 1937 he was named as the last protective custody and pre-trial detainee of the Confessing Church's nationwide intercession list, which was headed by Pastor Martin Niemöller, number 1, as Hitler's personal prisoner. Niemöller had been in captivity since the 1st of July 1937. At this time, about 40 cases were pending against the pastor. He was to be condemned as an enemy of the state in public at home and abroad, which meant also criminalizing the entire confessing church. But Niemöller's arrest triggered a wave of solidarity inside and outside Germany. His own congregation in Berlin-Dahlem gathered every evening in St. Anne's Church for a service for all prisoners. On the 7th of February 1938, his trial finally began before the special court in Berlin-Moabit, which sentenced him to 7 months in prison on the 2nd of March 1938. As he'd already served his time in pre-trial detention, he was released, only to be arrested again by the Gestapo as soon as he left the court. This time he was taken to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp as Adolf Hitler's personal prisoner. He wasn't to be freed until the end of the war. After his release from prison, Heinrich Graf zu Dorne-Schlobitten, as a member of the East Prussian Brethren Council, campaigned for Sporleder to be appointed assistant preacher of the Confessing Church in Marienberg, today Malbork in Poland. Sporleder took over on the 1st of May 1938, succeeding Helmut Passauer. There, like his predecessor, he was the only confessional clergyman facing 4 German Christian pastors. This was also the time when he had his first intensive contacts with later members of the military resistance. His services were regularly attended by Gestapo informants, and he was denounced on several occasions by parishioners because of the content of his sermons and his confirmation classes. On the 7th of July 1938, he married the 27-year-old Anne-Marie Weissenborn, a daughter of the former mayor of Halberstadt in Lauenburg, today Lemberg in Pomerania, Poland. Through his brother-in-law Gert Szymanski and his friend Willy Karp, Sporleder came into contact with the opposition writer Ernst Wiechert, who was Szymanski's teacher at the Hufen School in Königsberg. In the autumn of 1938 he stood as a defendant in 2 trials before the Reich Court for collecting donations for the Confessing Church and preaching sermons for reprimanded and imprisoned pastors. After he had sharply denounced the November pogroms against the Jewish population and prayed for the persecuted at the New Year's Eve service in St. Mary's Church in 1938, he was removed from office at the beginning of 1939 and banned from speaking, at the joint instigation of the Reich Church authorities, the Reich Church Ministry and the Gestapo. In response to his removal from office, the church authorities Königsberg and the state authorities received more than 200 letters of protest from members of the Marienburg Confessing Church. He was then allowed to continue teaching his existing confirmation classes until their confirmation in the spring of 1939. However, he was forbidden from preaching and entering Marienburg St. George's Church and its use for confessional services, which was now generally prohibited. The congregation then held its services in secret in the private homes of the Marienburg congregation members under Sporleder's leadership. On the day that German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop was being entertained by Stalin and Molotov whilst preparing for the invasion of Poland, that is to say the 26th of August 1939, Sporleder was called up into the Wehrmacht. How he fared as an opponent of the regime in the army during World War II we shall see in part 2.